Hello and welcome. We're going to look at graphing solutions to one-step inequalities. So we're going to take what we had done with solving one and two-step equations, but now we're looking at solving those one-step inequalities for that variable. Some things that we have to remember before we start practicing is if we're solving for that variable, we want to make sure that we use those inverse operations in order to undo the inequality in order to get the variable by itself. Okay, so remember with those inverse operations, if you have addition, your inverse is going to be to subtract. If you have subtraction, your inverse is to add. Same thing goes with multiplication and division. They go together. They're inverse operations of one another. You want to make sure that you do the same operation on both sides. So the inequality sign is going to replace that equal sign that what we saw with solving equations. Now we're going to have the inequality sign, which we'll go over those, review those in just a moment. We also want to remember that when we are solving for these for the variables in these inequalities, if you have to multiply or divide by a negative number, you're going to take that inequality sign that you have, whatever it may be, and you're going to flip it. So if you have a greater than sign, you would flip it to be a less than sign, but that's only when you're multiplying or dividing by a negative number. When you're graphing those inequalities, you're going to fill in the circle if you want to include the number. So anytime you see that you have the greater than or equal to or less than or equal to sign, then you're going to fill in that number. If you just have a sign that says greater than or less than, that's where you're going to have an open circle that's actually going to exclude that number. Some of the signs that we're going to look at just to review. So when you have a less than sign, you are going to have a sign that is going to point away from the variable, we'll say. So if we have the variable here, x is less than the variable, and that's how you would read it. You're going to read it from left to right. If the sign is pointing, whatever the sign is pointing at is telling you that that is the greater side. So in this case, this side is the greater side. So x is less than this number. Less than or equal to is going to be your less than sign, and then it's going to have part of that equal sign with it. Okay. Greater than is going to be the other way. You would read this as, we could say this is x is greater than this number over here. And then if we have greater than or equal to, we would have this line here. You could also look at it as if you have a less than sign, your circle for your graph would be an open circle. If you had less than or equal to, your circle is going to be a closed circle that's going to include that number. Greater than is going to be an open circle, and greater than or equal to is going to be a closed circle. And you can see down here we have this example. The arrow should always point towards the possible solutions. And in this case, we're looking at an example that says x is greater than or equal to -2, which means that we would have this open circle at -2 to include this number. And then it's going to point in the direction that is greater than that number. So all of these numbers that it's pointing to are greater than -2. And so they all could be possible solutions to this inequality. We're going to take a look at some examples of solving one-step inequalities where we're looking at using the correct sign, the correct inequality symbol, also if it's going to be an open or a closed circle, and then which direction we would shade our graph to include the correct answers. So here is an example that we have. It says solve the inequality and graph the solution. So we have two parts to this style of question. This inequality reads 1 is less than d minus 1. So the first thing that you are going to need to do is you're going to need to solve the inequality, because you cannot graph it until you know what the answer, what the solution is going to be. So if we rewrite this down here, d minus 1, we want to look at what operation do we have, and we can identify this and say that we have subtraction. And so that means our inverse operation is going to be, we want to add on both sides. That is our inverse. We're going to undo the question. So we are going to add 1 because we want to get the variable by itself. And you can also, you can circle the variable. That always helps as well. If you circle the variable, that's going to tell you what you want to get alone, what you were trying to undo to get by itself. So in this case, when we add 1 over here, we also have to look at this inequality sign, and we have to add on the other side as well. Similar to solving 1 and 2-step equations, the inequality sign is going to act as the equal sign, and that's going to separate the inequality. When we say do the inverse on both sides, it's going to be both sides of the inequality sign. So in this case, -1 plus 1, this is actually going to cancel for us, leaving us with 0, or we could just rewrite this as we have d left over here. Our inequality sign is going to stay because we're not multiplying or dividing. The only time you have to question if you have to flip the sign is if you are multiplying or dividing by a negative number. So in this case, since we have subtraction and addition, we would just leave the inequality sign as is. And then we would say 1 plus 1 is 2. So our answer could read d is less than, or I'm sorry, 2 is less than d. Or you could read it the other way, but be careful when you do this because the inequality sign is pointed opening towards the d. So you would flip it in this case to have it read correctly. So this is the same thing. 2 is less than d, or d is greater than 2. That's also going to tell us when we start to graph up here, we have a less than, or if you flipped it the other way, we have a greater than sign. So that's going to tell us that our circle is going to be an open circle at 2. And then we could say, which direction are we going to shade? We would say that anything that is greater than d. So we would shade this direction. Okay. So this is what your final solution should be to this question. Let's look at another one. If we have this here, we want to solve the inequality and graph the solution. It reads 3r is less than 6. So I'm going to rewrite this down here. 3r is less than 6. We want to identify, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to place that circle around my variable. And when I have that circle around the variable and I look at 3 and r, I can identify the operation. If I knew what the variable was, I know that I would be multiplying 3 times r. So since I know that I'm multiplying, my inverse is going to be to divide, to undo it. So in this case, I'm going to divide, and I'm looking at the inequality sign as the other, similar to my equal sign. So I'm going to divide on the other side of the inequality sign as well. And I'm going to divide everything by this number that is with the variable. So I want to divide everything by 3. I would be left with, this is going to cancel 3 divided by 3 is just 1, or we could just write the variable as r. My inequality sign is going to stay as a less than sign. I am multiplying or dividing in this case. I am dividing. So I do want to make sure, did I divide by a negative number? And I did not. I divided both sides by a +3. So that means that my inequality sign can stay as is. And then 6 divided by 3 is going to be 2. So my solution to this is going to be r is less than 2. I can look at this and I can say, okay, I have a less than sign. It's not less than or equal to, which means I'm going to have an open circle at 2. And then I could look at this as well, and I could say, okay, which side am I going to shade to? And I could say r is less than 2, so any of these numbers that are less than 2. A good thing, I'm not sure if any of you have heard this before, but when you have the variable on the left side, so r is on the left, r is less than 2, your inequality sign kind of tells you which direction you're going to shade to. It tells you that you're going to shade, it's going to point to the direction. So in this case, it's saying that it's less than, but it's pointing to the left. So that means you would shade to the left. But remember, that only really works if your variable is on this side of the equation. If it's on the other side, it will be different. So let's look at another example. Here we have, we are again solving the inequality and graphing the solution. And it says Q minus 8 is greater than or equal to 1. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this down here. Q minus 8 is greater than or equal to 1. I want to first identify the operation that I have, and I can see that I have subtraction. And I can also identify the variable that I have, which is my Q. So Q minus 8. So since I can see that the operation would be to subtract, my inverse operation would be to add 8 to both sides of the inequality sign. And what that's going to do is negative 8 plus a positive 8 is going to cancel and just leave us with the variable Q. We had subtraction, and inverse operation was to add, so we don't have to worry about flipping our inequality sign. We were not multiplying or dividing by a negative number, so we would leave that as less than or equal to, and then 1 plus 8 is going to give us 9. So our solution to this equation is going to be Q is greater than or equal to 9. When we're graphing this, we can see that we have a greater than or equal to sign. And so that's going to tell us that we're going to have a closed circle at 9. And then when it comes to which direction we're going to shade, and this is what I said, it works if the variable is on the left, because you could see this inequality sign is pointing to the right. And that is true. We are going to shade the graph to the right. Any of those numbers that are greater than or equal to 9, so it does include 9, those would work for this inequality. Let's look at another one of these styles of questions. So here we are solving the inequality and graphing the solution. We have V divided by 3, or V over 3, is less than or equal to 2. So we're going to write this here. V over 3 is less than or equal to 2. I'm going to identify my variable. And then I'm also going to look at, I have V over 3, which is written as a fraction. And we know that if we think back to fractions, we know that fractions are actually division problems. So V, we could read this as V over 3 or V divided by 3. So since we have division, that means that our inverse operation is going to be to multiply. And what do we multiply by? We are going to multiply by the reciprocal of the number. So we're going to multiply both sides and set up a kind of a fraction. But what we're going to do, the reciprocal is this fraction, but it's flipped over. So instead of 3 being on the bottom, it is going to go to the top. We don't want to take the variable with us, though. So we have to remember that in front of these variables, there is a 1 in front. And so instead of taking the variable with us, we're just going to bring the 1 with us. leave the variable because we do want to get that by itself. And then this is going to cancel and leave us with just 1, but we have to remember we got to do it to the other side as well. So 3/1 multiplied. We'll be left with our variable over here. We are dividing, but we are not dividing, or I'm sorry, we have division here. We're going to multiply as the inverse. But we're not multiplying by a negative number. And so that means that our sign, our inequality symbol, is just going to stay as a less than or equal to sign. When you multiply 2 times 3/1, you could always multiply. This is actually written as 2/1 as well. You can write whole numbers over 1 as fractions. So we're just going to multiply these fractions straight across. 2 times 3 is 6. And we could say 6/1. But we know that 6/1 is the same thing as 6, so I would just leave this as v is less than or equal to 6. When we graph this, we can see we have a less than or equal to sign, so that means we're going to have a closed circle at 6. And that also, when we look at which way are we going to shade our graph, we can see that this is v is less than or equal to 6. So we're going to go, it's pointing to the left. The variable is on the left. So we can say that anything less than the number 6 would be a solution. All right, and we're going to look at one more question. So here we're solving for the inequality and we are graphing the solution. We have q over -1 is greater than 8. So we're going to rewrite this down here. Q over -1 is greater than 8. We want to identify the variable that we have in this question, which is q. And then we want to also think about what is our operation that we would be doing and what's the inverse going to be. So in this case, we have q over -1, or we could read this as q divided by -1. So since this is division, our inverse is going to be to multiply. We will be multiplying. And we're going to multiply by the reciprocal. So both sides of this inequality, this -1 is going to come to the top. And then we remember that we have a 1 in front of q. So we don't want to bring the variable. We're just going to bring the 1. Okay, we have to do this to both sides as well. -1/1. And some of you may have caught what's going to happen with this question, okay? So the main thing with inequalities that we've been going through is if you are multiplying or dividing by a negative number, you need to flip the inequality sign, okay? So in this case, we are going to end up multiplying by a -1. So what that's going to do is that's going to take this inequality sign. It is read currently as a greater than sign. So we are going to flip this to a less than sign. Okay, it stays greater than or less than, or if there was greater than or equal to, it would go to a less than or equal to sign. But it does stay, you're not going to change it to a less than or equal to sign if it's not a greater than or equal to sign. So in this case, we'd go from a greater than to a less than sign. This is going to cancel for us. And we're going to be left with a variable of q. And then we could always write this as 8/1. So we're going to multiply straight across. 8 times -1 is a -8. And you could write it over 1, or we could just leave it like this. Okay. Now we're going to graph this and we're going to look and we're going to see we have a q is less than -8. And so we're going to have an open circle at -8. And then we are going to shade less than with negative numbers. They're actually going to look like they're getting bigger, but it's actually a smaller quantity. So -10 is less than -8. -6 is greater than -8. So we are going to shade in this direction. And the way we look at that is on the number line. In the positive direction, as the numbers grow, they do get bigger. But the further we go in the other direction, the smaller those numbers get.